Hello and welcome to this RedMonk Conversation. My name is Kate Holterhoff. I'm a senior analyst at RedMonk. And with me today, I have John Ellis. He's the president of Codethink and the contributor of the Eclipse Trustable Software Framework at the Eclipse Foundation. John, thanks so much for joining me here on the Monkcast.
Good morning and welcome. Thank you. Appreciate the time.
So let's begin with some definitions here because I'm sure not everybody is familiar with some of these things. So what is the Eclipse Trustable Software Framework and how did the project begin?
First, Codethink is the contributor, not me. I know in our intro, sort of just make sure, but so the Eclipse Trustable Software Framework actually started as the Trustable Software Framework, and it started, Codethink started that journey a good number of years ago, about 2016. Bosch asked the question, could open source be used to deliver safety critical context? We, being a Bosch partner, we looked into that question, and we came quickly to the determination that it could, but it wouldn't work commercially because of the opaque, open source is open, the safety critical is closed. There's contracts, there's NDAs, there's confidentiality, so there's a mismatch in the business model. But in doing that work, we actually came upon a deeper question, which is, well, why do we even trust software? And question actually prompted us to look, forgetting the safety certificate, why do we trust software? And as professionals, we had a vast amount of examples which suggested maybe we shouldn't. And thus was born the project and a whole bunch of other sort of steps behind that. But it then resulted in the Trustable Software Framework, which we got to a point where like, this is something that's going to work. And then we realized it needed to be open. And so then we contributed it to the Eclipse group, specifically the SDV working group.
Okay. That's a good pithy history here. I like that. So you've been doing a lot of talking about this. I've been fortunate enough to watch a couple of your presentations. So I feel like I have my bearings at least a little bit here. And so I'm hoping that we can dig into some of the things that you have said already about this framework. So just to begin with, I was really struck by your metaphor about bridge building and how that relates to trust here, because I feel like trust is kind of one of those ambiguous terms. Like, yeah, we want trust. Okay. But like, what does it mean specifically to have trust in software?
Yeah. So it is, it's a great metaphor, and it does often, poke the audience in a very specific way, right? The metaphor very specifically is in ancient times, right? The anecdote is that architects and bridge builders were forced to sleep under the bridge, right? To prove to society that what they built was in essence safe or usable, right? And if they refused to do it, then, society should take a step back and question like what actually happened. And so the metaphor says exactly the same for software today, especially as we're talking about the software in such embedded and regulated markets, right? Aviation being one, but autonomous vehicles. We are asking society to allow for, basically in essence, technology companies and engineers sitting at a desk to make decisions that impact society at large. And so, we've actually provoked the engineer. Would you be willing to put your loved ones on the road, laying horizontally in front of an oncoming vehicle? And again, it's intended to provoke deeper thinking about like, what does it really mean to trust software? Are we comfortable that a safety cert is sufficient? Are we comfortable that commercial contracts are sufficient? Like, what does it really mean to have trust? And what part of the Trustable Software Framework and sort of the journey, right, in terms of getting there is those individual points are not sufficient. Like, I can't have just you saying, here's a cert, trust me on this date. Like, it's a continuing relationship between me, society specifically, and how this works. So we hope that in framing that metaphor, right, we get people to really pause and say like, oh, wow, like, yeah, this is a really big deal. And a contract or a license or a cert or whatever else we currently use today is really insufficient in allowing for us to actually have that conversation.
Okay, that helps. And I love thinking about software as a bridge because I feel like you could take that image anywhere. But one of the places that I find interesting that you take it is to this conversation around integrations. So you have described integrations as this moment of truth. So it's like this button push where they're just hoping that it works, right? And these unknown dependencies and non-reproducible binaries, they suddenly surface and everything is kumbaya. So talk to me about integration and how it factors into your thinking around trustable software.
Yeah, I just as with everything I like to do, there's analogs and metaphors, and the reason for integration, in part, one of the conversations that I had in at least one of the talks that I think you've seen is we talk about sort of like the idea of a factory, or the idea of where integration occurs. We can contemplate a factory metaphor. And at least for most of the audiences working in equipment, like if it's automotive or medical or others, having very similar models, right? They have an OEM that has a whole concept of a factory and building of a physical product. And it is incredibly interesting that when you talk about the factory, down to the nth detail, they have exactly what they're expecting, when they're expecting, how to expect it, how to integrate it, right? The factory is where there are no surprises. Like there are no surprises. You do not, in fact, everything is about making sure the factory works. Unfortunately, that mindset hasn't actually come over to software. And so because it's not in software, that's what we mean by the integration. And so the one talk that you saw where we had the picture is like all these things very similar to a physical factory. I've got a package coming from a vendor or a silicon package with software coming. I have deliverables in essence coming to me, but they're not governed as they would be governed in the physical world. And so because of that, this integration process is where surprises come. And again, that's where software becomes the reality of the integration, becomes the moment in truth when like, oh, for the first time ever, I'm now looking at all the dependencies and I'm seeing all the different things. And that's where things and surprises happen to come from. So again, we start from the basis of that physical world model and we're like, there should be no reason why it's not in the software world. We call that, and that's where the Trustable Software Framework basically embeds and embodies that in some of the tenets.
Interesting. And can you give any history to that? Like, why is it that it's this moment of integration that we have tolerated, that this please work moment is going to be so important? Where does this come from?
It's I think it's a couple different things. Number one is we have historically, certainly from purchasing, we have brought people over from the physical world who you would think would have that, but when they came over to the digital world, they didn't bring the model with them. So there's not the same level of diligence, I would argue. Number two is we have some, oftentimes it just worked, or there's been a disconnect to work, meaning, oh, it was able to be shipped, and then sort of afterwards the recalls or the other points in the sort of failure thing. We just haven't applied to the software engineering discipline the same level of rigor that we apply to the physical world of factory and physical engineering. So many of my colleagues at Codethink would argue software engineering is not yet really a discipline. We haven't gotten there yet because we don't have all of the other things that you would expect to see in some of that engineering discipline in terms of the rigor, in terms of the post-analysis, in terms of the society understanding. Something failed, we understand it, we make it, we remediate it, we fix it, and we go back. And so I think it's a multi-part problem, right? There's a lot of different stakeholders for the reasons to the why. And I think what we're finally seeing is at least in some of our example products, the rigor is now drawing into question because we can see the recalls or the failures. I mean, I think you saw the one slide I talked about. There's trillions of dollars being accounted for economic loss. Like we have the data points. And so I think and again, the Eclipse Foundation and the SDV working group specifically is trying to address that. Like they're acknowledging that. And the Trustable Software Framework is sort of a step down that path to try and be the place where integration is contemplated and understood, right? One of the tenets, understand what you're getting, understanding what's coming to you, right? Is tenet number one, understand what you're building. And that is kind of that first step.
Okay. And as a former QA engineer, one of the things that I was really attracted to in this argument is that the beginning of the SDLC, the beginning of this production or the factory metaphor, it gets more attention than the end. And that's where things kind of fall off the rails. Do you feel like the SDLC is equipped to deal with these challenges, or like how are your ideas about this framework really challenging the way that software engineers have functioned up until now?
So the Trustable Software Framework is, well, Bosch asked the first question, and then there was a whole generation there was a period of time where there was an open, like in good software and in good open source form, Codethink provoked the question publicly and invited a public discussion about like, how can we trust software? How do you get to trust software? which those 6 tenets kind of come as the sort of summary of the 12 to 14 months, whatever the duration of the time was behind it. And so doing this, right, there was a lot of questioning about like, what does it mean to actually engineer software and how do we do it? And what was there? There was an acknowledgement of was like software is accessible more so than so much in the hardware world. Like in the hardware world, you need certain things that are not necessarily easily come buyable. And yet we can do in software. Like, I mean, you could write a macro in Excel and suddenly you're doing software, right? How many businesses have built themselves around macros built by people sitting at a desk and they don't even understand where that comes from, right? I mean, you're smiling, but like that's how easy this is.
Yeah.
So as we talk about what does it really mean, I think we're differentiating. I mean, more broadly, Codethink would argue, and I think the Eclipse Foundation would argue, software engineering writ large, right, needs to be thought of. But when we talk about the concept of safety critical or regulated industries, this is where we're really focused on, and the idea that software under contract isn't, putting it under a confidentiality agreement, putting it under a contract, making it hidden, making it less accessible, right? That's not the right approach. Like exactly that bridge metaphor. Like if somebody built the bridge and said, you can't study it, no third-party structural engineer can come in and look at this and do weight measures and analysis, like you can't do that. I think we'd all as a society balk at that. So why do we accept the alternative, like the opposite side of that on the software side? So when you say like, is the software development lifecycle or the way engineers are used to building software ready for this or whatnot? There are changes, right? There are understandings, but it comes down to being really engineering, and we really do want people to think deeply about what they're building, because again, society is impacted by anything and everything that these product companies release.
Yeah, that's huge. Okay, and so just thinking about this in terms of brass tacks, organizations, they're already using like SBOM, CI pipelines, testing requirements management. And so the question that I have that is, what is the ETSF connect or add that these practices aren't already providing?
Well, I mean, in it's a great observation, right? We do have a lot of the different things, and we do have them, right? And they do work to whatever limit they are, like the SBOMs and CI/CD, testing and others. And I think what I was highlighting when I talk about this publicly is they all exist, but in some cases they all exist in either silos or fragmentation. Like we look for an SBOM by the SBOM point. We don't think of SBOM as an everyday evidence that's coming in the course of a pipeline, right? Again, going back to that mainstream idea of a physical factory and like walking through a factory and what gets delivered and managed, and how do you manage a factory, and looking at like throughput and failure rates and others, right? There are things to be learned in that way. And so what the TSF, the Eclipse Trustable Software Framework brings is a way by which to contemplate that in its entirety, reason about it, and then reason about it in its entirety, not just an SBOM, and the SBOM is SPDX 2.x or 3. What, or even Cyclone DX, right? Not just SPDX, it could be Cyclone. We allow for the reasoning, because what we're trying to get to at the end of the day is, we don't think you can make a blanket statement, this is X. It's X for a period of time T against some understanding Y of the world. So at the end of the day, there has to be a level of confidence. Like, we're confident that this does what we say it does against these credentials or against these things, and here's why, and here's the evidence. And so ETSF, as you're referring to it, right, the Eclipse Trustable Software Framework, is intended to be that holistic way by which you can come to make the confidence statement, provide the evidence, and then allow a third party to reason independently and be able to say, yeah, I'm in agreement, or no, I have a different view of confidence, or yeah, I'm good, and let's go release this.
Okay. Yeah. And I'm interested in how that ties into the way that developers often have this fear of touching software, right? So in most regulated industries, they're treating changing chip software as this terrifying thing, right? It adds this level of uncertainty to something that they already know works. But my sense is that the ETSF allows you to be able to make changes and reason about whether or not they're actually going to work in a better way. And so that can help organizations feel better about making these changes. Is that a fair way of framing it? And how does that even tie into like where the regulators sit into this? Like how they're changing their posture in relation to these deployments?
So I mean, there's a couple different maybe threads to pull on there.
Yeah.
And probably the biggest one is the idea that this product, whatever it is, has to continue to operate in some level of your statements for 15 to 20 years. One of the things that I like to, when we talk to customers and clients, when I talk publicly, is software at the base level is just a mathematical or mental model of how I see the world at a point in time. And as an engineer, or I as a company, spend time, what I see the world today may or may not be the way I see the world in a year or 2 years or 3 years. I will have learned more about the world. I will have better understood the world. And so that mental model has something called decay. I know we don't talk about it, but just again, like the physical world, we spend so much time trying to figure out exactly where the tensile strength of steel fails when it's bent a certain way. We understand the incredible physics and chemistry of everything that we build, so that we have an understanding of tolerances and we can think about them and we have an understanding of that world. Very similarly, we have the same thing in software. We have created a model about what the world looks like, or what we think the world looks like at that point in time. But the model has to change because our understanding of the world has to change. So there's a construct that we have to contemplate changing our model over time. With that, against the 15 to 20 year viewpoint, somehow, some way, we have to accommodate the idea that we're going to have to make changes. So when you ask, like, well, how does that work, or how do we get to it? We would just offer and argue, if you fully understand what you've built, if you fully understand where it comes from, if you fully appreciate it, then you should be comfortable making changes. You may choose not to make changes, but that's a decision as an engineer that you're making with all the facts, not because, oh, I can't change it because I don't know what's going to happen, or I'm afraid of what's going to happen, right? So our tenet 3 is the ability to make changes and understand, right? And be comfortable to make those changes. Again, when I say that, please don't take from me, we were talking making changes willy-nilly. It's not like some guy today is just going to wake up and tomorrow make it. This is the understanding that I can make changes. I do the deep engineering, I understand it, and I've come to an agreement as a community, whatever that community definition is, that yes, this is an appropriate change. It will work. We've studied it, we understand it, and we've made the change. And we're not afraid to make the change. Moreover, we're willing to study the world's impact as the change propagates, and again, understand, etc. I always like to point out to people, right, if you look at any of the Voyagers or any of the stuff that NASA and JPL have done, like where they have stuff built from the 70s or 80s out, and they're making full software changes years later, it just doesn't happen. Like the engineers come and they deeply think about it. That's the kind of stuff we're talking about. And that's the mindset that we're trying to get into. Do not be afraid to make changes. That doesn't mean you do make changes. Just do not be afraid to make changes because of X. That's what we're trying to get across to people.
Okay. And my sense is that versioning and Git are extremely important to how this will look in practice. Can you talk more about that?
I mean, it's versioning and Git, but I mean, it's going to be down to business practices as a company writ large, right? The ability to actually manage, again, this comes down to, if I go back to physical factories, right? It is incredible the amount of documentation and detail we have about anything that we received, how we manage it, how we manufacture it, how it comes to, like, we have all that. That same level of engineering understanding is what we're looking for as our sort of North Star goal as we talk about software. So yes, it's Git, it's versioning control. It's not just versioning control, it's like understanding edits. Did I allow, Kate to make edits independent to, did Kate's edits get reviewed? Were Kate's edits, did they touch upon anything safety critical? If they did, what do we do about that? What does that look like? I mean, it's not just versioning, it's the integrity of how do I manage this as a thing, and how do I understand the management of its changes, its evolution, its life, and then again, am I still able to say that with X confidence, I'm good that this thing will do what it's supposed to do and is going to behave in the way it's supposed to behave, and I have a level of confidence that it won't harm people or goods.
So I feel like some folks might listen to this and be worried that this is going to result in higher headcount, less lean, it'll decrease velocity. They might be worried about the bottlenecks that this might create. How do you address that fear?
I mean, could it? I mean, maybe. But I think that's a bubble. Like it's at the beginning part. If you know, in our experience with customers, once they've gotten a factory model, once they've adopted the idea that this factory is no different than the physical factory that they run to build the product, it has the same governance, the same discipline, the same things. Mm-hmm. They get that, and once they have the necessary governance in place, then you can start optimizing throughput for builds, others, etc. It's only once you have that in place can you then have the ability to start figuring out how to optimize where necessary for you, right? At the end of the day, the Eclipse Trustable Software Framework leaves a lot of latitude to what does it mean to be trustable, right? It's really up to the company in question to start saying, like, here's my evidence for the claim I've made, and here's why I think this is good. Like, now others can look at it. But once you have the instrumentation and the machinery in place, now you can start thinking about, like, well, how do I optimize? Do I have development in a specific region? Now, how do I start changing things? How do I start optimizing the contracts that I'm entering into? How do I optimize? Again, one of the things that we look, you know, deeply on is how do I optimize, you know, against software sovereignty? Do I own my own software, or am I just a massive integrator at scale and I'm just getting all the software from third parties and shipping it and putting a label on it, right? These are the questions that come up naturally, commercially. Once you've answered them and you have the instrumentation, our experience is you can get speed, but you have to start from the concept of this structure. You just can't try for speed's sake.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that's reasonable. I want to return to the bridge metaphor because I'm thinking through the sort of positive things that this enables versus, I guess, the negative and the absence. So it's very clear with a bridge. You either sleep under the bridge or you don't.
Right.
With software, how are you testing this negative? Like, how are you determining an absence of bad behavior here? It just seems like it's hard to check for the absence of a happy path, right? So, like, how do you actually generate continuous evidence for this negative, this untrustworthiness?
Yeah, so it's a great question, one we get often, and for us specifically, we'll talk to you a little bit about. So I want to be very clear. TSF does have as part of, like, some of the expectations. So, you know, tenets 4 and 5, the expectations and the evidence. We actually do employ a risk analysis. Like, it's not like just a bunch of people sitting in a room. Like, there's an actual formal risk analysis. And in the case of the Trustable Software Framework, what we actually came through was it's predicated on STPA, Systemic Theoretic Process Analysis, which came out of MIT, Nancy Levinson and John Thomas. And was originally envisioned for aviation, and the idea that you don't get safety by plugging two safe things together. You have to look at things in a much higher level, is what the premise of the approach was. Through working with MIT and this, you know, Codethink came to understand that it wasn't necessarily tuned exactly for software, and so we created something called RAFIA, also open source, but the risk analysis fault induction automation. So the risk analysis is all the STPA. You do your loss scenarios, you understand and for the context that you're talking about, you try and identify what can be done or what can't be done, i.e. the loss scenarios. Our insight in terms of the fault induction is that, well, it's software. So we can actually either write, change, modify to induce the fault that we think shouldn't happen in the world and see how the system performs and validate that the system holds true in the case that negative actually showed up. So we actually do that. And in so doing it, we've uncovered problems for any package that we've looked at where, again, there are corner cases or others where we've made changes and upstreamed them. Once we understand it, we can then automate the test to validate does that still hold true over time. And so, again, the STPA is where we do all the analysis and come up with the ideas. The fault induction is where we actually take advantage of the fact that it is software, and we can force the changes that we think shouldn't happen to happen. and then we can see how the system performs, and then we automate it, and then we just run that every time. And as we like to say, if it squeals, then we know something's wrong. We have to stop. We have to go look at it and understand. But again, if it doesn't squeal, we're able to continually keep that. So yes, that's where the testing and the body of testing increases over time. Every single time we find where there might be a loss, and we've forced it to happen and proved that it shouldn't, or we've proved how the system behaves.
So what interests me about that is there's such a, I guess, a binary between this pass-fail mindset that you think of with like regulators and assessors versus this statistically driven, like, we are confident to X% that this complex software is going to be trustworthy. How do you get regulators and assessors on board with this understanding that's a little bit more nuanced and a little more effective in the real world?
Similarly to how, so you're right. Historically, their view of the world has been in the physical world. It's all about its testing. It's all about statistical analysis and failures and understanding failure rate, which is why you get the hours of use or the exceptional sort of testing rigor that takes you to the negative exponent of time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so part of our journey has been to raise the awareness that software should be treated no differently. Like the statistical confidence is something necessary. And in fact, Codethink's not unique in this. There's a lot of embedded developers who are putting forward that the idea of claims should be Bayesian based, not just analog true false based, because if it's only true for 85%, but you're in an analog, then it's false. And then the engineer's like, well, but wait a minute, like 85%, like, so this is the exact same world that we live in the physical world. You're right. It's a change. That is a mindset change. And it's a mindset change that, especially in the embedded world, we think is overdue simply for the fact that the complexity of the software we're talking about, even if the software was written by hand, the complexity of what we're talking about in terms of the world is far greater than I think the idea of just binary true false allows for. And so we know how to do it, statistical process controls in the real world. We understand how to handle it and accommodate it. And it turns out even some of the standards bodies are beginning to acknowledge in software that there might be a need for some statistical understanding. Not there yet, but there's at least a growing conversation broadly that's just not just about the TSF, and not even because we necessarily said it. We're just amplifying that message.
Well, I mean, that certainly seems to resonate with what we're hearing in our AI era, where there's this whole new breed of chained vulnerabilities, and we're sort of in this new era about what the CVE landscape looks like. So sort of applying that to what you're talking about here, we're seeing the need for changing our priors, right? That we are all adapting to make sure that we're creating the best software possible in this new era. And a lot of it's attributable to AI, but a lot of it's been here forever, right? This is a historical situation that is perhaps shifting, but isn't going anywhere. And as maybe part of that, I want to talk about the black box nature of certifications historically. So traditional certifications, they're kind of opaque for folks on the outside. So I'm interested in how you're grappling with this sense that teams are unsure what's actually happening behind the scenes with the NDAs, the fact that they're just not entirely sure what these assessors are looking at. Can you speak to that at all about like trying to break through that veil?
Yeah, sure. So, as just background, right? So Codethink has gone through a number of different certification processes. We've actually achieved an ASIL-D against 26262 for some of our building construction. We've actually gotten, the TSF itself certified against 61508, and we've gotten our version of control, which is Linux, right, to a baseline assessment through 6115. So we're familiar with the process. And I only context to talk about then sort of like why and how do we take our position in terms of trying to, as you said, break through. I think the first thing to acknowledge is the idea of a safety certificate, I think itself is a misnomer. There is a certificate from an organization, AK Exida or TUV or UL, against some standard. But if you actually read the certificate, at no point is the word safe present. What is present are words like, we have seen, ample evidence of the company in question following process for this product in question, right? We've seen, and therefore they have received this certificate, right? We don't see the idea of the third party intermediary saying, we, the company, hereby attest that this product is safe based on X, Y, Z. So, and this is all with respect to software, right? I'm talking about and so we find that super interesting. And when we've pushed on it, it's like, yeah, because at the end of the day, right, they're not making a claim of safety. What they're making a claim of is a process was followed. And then it's up to the industry to recognize whether or not they accept that process as ergo being something that's safe. Why that's interesting is because that ties back to your earlier question of like statistical process control. The idea of if you build it by hand and it's binary and all these things are controlled and it's contained and it never changes, we can make some statement about something. And so, yeah, if you follow the process, we'll equate that to safe. In the complex world we live in, we know that that is not really the case. And I'm offer as evidence is, as I said to everyone, if it were the case that it was right, then in theory, we shouldn't see what we're seeing in the marketplace, which is the idea of a safety recall. A recall from the United States government is a safety issue. And increasingly, these recalls are software related. So if in fact it were working, we shouldn't see an increase in recalls. We should in fact see a decrease in recalls because we're actually doing the right things. So what we offer as evidence is there is something about the complexity nature of software. There's something about the integration. There's something about everything that we're talking about that demands us as engineers to really deeply study this and understand how it is that we construct, build, and deploy this software. Ergo, why we go back to traditional methods, I think they're short in terms of being able to actually have somebody sleep on that road. Well, a multi-thousand-pound vehicle at 80 miles an hour is traveling down the lane, and we expect it to stop or avoid the person on the road. So that's where we would put our thought process at.
Do you suspect that this will have some upstream ramifications, this being the framework and trustable software? Do you see that the assessors are then going to need to shift their way of addressing the industry?
I don't think it's just assessors. I think it's assessors, regulators, society. I mean, yeah. I think all of us need to shift how we manage, how we deal with, and how we understand and deploy, right, this level of software. And again, the data points in the marketplace, whether it's the increase in safety recalls or if it's just the losses economically, right, suggest that what we're doing is insufficient. And again, we would offer the Eclipse Trustable Software Framework in support of a change. We're not suggesting that it is the only change, but we are suggesting it is a piece of a change. And again, offering to stand by it as part of like, how do you come to be able to say the word, I'm confident, or I can trust that what I'm doing, won't harm.
And with so many stakeholders involved, I suspect many of our listeners are going to be, are going to have their skeptics hat on of like, is this a foxes guarding the hen house situation? Like, who's really making sure that this is something that we need to all be following here? So I just want to make sure that we're addressing those questions.
But okay, so to just add the plus one color to what you just said, like suggesting for a moment that the ETSF by itself is the tool. Like there is still somebody or some entity that has to say I'm confident. But what we are suggesting is this framework then allows for you, the recipient of my statement of confidence, to actually independently look at that and look and understand it and study it and be able to come to your own conclusions. Was the evidence provided sufficient, or is it sufficient? Is it sufficient for the statement of confidence that they're giving us? And if it's not, to challenge them, like, I'm sorry, but that evidence is insufficient for your strong confidence level. You're missing the follow. Right? It allows finally for the ability, right, for that structural engineer on the outside looking at the bridge to say, independent of you sleeping underneath it, I have the following issues with how it was built and how it's supposed to work and how society is supposed to accept this into the lexicon of things that society depend on.
All very reasonable expectations here. I like that as someone who could potentially drive over a bridge with my kids in the back seat. Absolutely. I do want that. So this is all for the good here. So thinking of regulators and folks who might be looking into the trust issue, let's talk about the CRA. So we at RedMonk have spoken with the Eclipse folks at some length about the importance of this. I feel like you folks have really taken a leadership position in trying to express to the industry why this is so important. And so the CRA being the EU Cyber Resilience Act. And so the consistent signal that we are hearing is that businesses are unprepared. And I'm interested in your read on the CRA readiness issue across Europe today. What is driving that awareness gap?
Well, I mean, so first off, as you can tell by my accent, I'm not European, and I don't live in Europe.
Yeah, sure.
So anything I'm going to share with you is really a recital of what comes from my time with Eclipse.
Okay.
So I think broadly, regardless of Europe and all those disclaimers I just made, it is my, as I say in most of my conversations, when I talk about the fact that so much of our world is governed by software, it still to this day shocks me at just the gross misunderstanding or lack of understanding that sit at board levels, at executive teams for what software really is. As it's super interesting when I get asked questions, and I always point to this, right? If you want to be a board member, or if you want to be someone, a CEO or an executive or a COO, you better understand the factory. You better understand supply chain and finance. Nowhere is it you better understand software, or you better understand how software is built, even if their product is so dependent on it. So when we talk about the CRA gap, in part is because these executives don't fully appreciate just how much software, right, is in or part of what they do, number one. I think it's also the fact that I don't know how much in the U.S., and I'm just being through the lens of the U.S., did we talk about the CRA? Like, I can remember when GDPR was coming up. It was a brand new novel concept, but guess what? Lots of law departments were all over our stuff, raising this awareness. When I was back, working in a for-profit, publicly traded company, the lawyers were all over us. Like, this is a thing, and we're going to have to comply with it. And I don't know that that's actually happening at the same level, because I don't know that there's an awareness of that necessary requirement. And again, unfortunately, unless the attorneys are telling you have to do it, sometimes that gap exists. So I think there's an awareness at the level of the executives. I think there's also awareness broadly. That said, once you go through it and you start pointing these things out, I've been in meetings, I've been in sessions where we'll go through the key points. So when we first start, how many believe it covers them? No hands up. By the end of the session, how many believe it covers you? And all the hands are up. And you're like, wow, okay. So now what? It's a journey. And I think it's going to be a journey just like the GDPR. I mean, to this day, we're still kind of fighting through key points of the GDPR. Like, what's really the rights in all this? It's more settled than it was, but that's almost 15 years, right? Roughly 10, 12, 13 years. I mean, it's been a long time. I suspect the same journey will happen for the CRA.
Man, so my takeaway from what you just said is that, the awareness is still lacking, but also that this is not going to happen anytime soon. I mean, what I keep hearing is like, it's coming. But even when it's here, we're talking years in the future, we're still going to be grappling with what that actually means. Oh, my goodness.
I think so, because at the end of the day, there's no, as we point out, right, there is I think the what is really well defined. We can argue how it's defined, like who's a vendor and who's materially responsible. We can argue the definitions, right? That's the what. And it's obviously codified, and it's been made law, and we can debate that, but it's codified. So I think we could argue that the what is defined well. What's not defined, or at least not defined well, is how do you actually show when asked compliance, or that you are in line with, right? Whatever the word right is. I don't know if it's a compliant. Well, how do you do that? Like, and so there are things now that's where I think gaps are, and that's kind of why we are positioning the ETSF as the way to show the how. Like, we are arguing that the evidence required to support the know what you're building tenet 1, being able to build reproducibly tenet 2, being able to make changes and understand them, right? Tenets 1, 2, the evidence just behind those would be strongly sufficient, we argue, for what the commission's looking for when they've laid out the CRA what. Again, that's still to be debated, and it still has to be tested. But that's what we think is missing in the CRA, is the how. And therefore, until there's a real definition of how, I think it's going to be time until people understand and settle on, okay, we've all agreed this is a how, they've agreed, and we're now showing you the how on a regular basis or whatever the requirement is. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm glad we did this check-in here because I think it was last fall that we published our episode on the CRA with Mike Milikovich. So this is all good. We're checking in. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I want to return to a subject I alluded to briefly, which is AI. So a growing share of code is written by AI now, unquestionably.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that the provenance issue is becoming more murky, right? I am interested in how you factor into that. Like, you've got this evidence-based model. It seems like it's becoming more important now. And I guess I would like to have your sense of, like, can a framework accommodate the code whose origins are so difficult to trace?
So to start, I would argue that the framework just gives you a framework for making sure that you've answered the question on provenance. Like, the acceptability of provenance is ultimately the company in question or the entity in question who's making the confidence claim. So, and that's where, again, the ability to reason about this. So if I show up to you, Kate, and say, here's my confidence, you look at provenance, like, you didn't tell me where that stuff came from. Like, make that claim. That's
sure.
Only do that in light of the framework giving you the tools in the quote unquote framework by which to analyze, study, and challenge me, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we don't actually make a claim for, like, what is provenance is a framework. You still have to do the thing necessary for a company but we give you all the tools, we give you guidelines, and we show you this. What's interesting for us at Codethink is we are using this to take our Linux distribution through the actual same process that we're expecting anyone else to take an open source or even a closed source project through, right? We're not sitting here pontificating on high. We're actually trying to do the actual work necessary. And so, as I mentioned earlier, like, we actually have a baseline safety assessment that says, yes, you can actually use this Linux in an engineered system up to SIL 3 ASIL D. Like, it said that. The assessor came back. It's a properly engineered system, right? It's not just generic. So when you ask me about the provenance, basically our answer for AI is, absent any ethical concerns that we might have or anyone might have, it's very easy to say, did you check do you have a claim or a requirement that who gave you this, who is delivering this to you, attested or made a claim for, is there AI? That's like an early step. And if there is, you make the decision. Are you comfortable with that? Like, you have to at the end of the day, the company still has an obligation as engineers. Are you comfortable that AI was used? And if you are and you're confident, then you give me your evidence for that confidence level. And we can now talk about that. In terms of us personally, if we find AI involved, like what we guide our clients and customers to is, like, listen, the framework allows for you to provide a lower score or a lower trust or a lower factor. So if we say, like, we don't know where this provenance is, it's AI. Or, for example, a vendor only gives me a binary. Like, they will not ever give me the actual source. They only give me a binary. We would also offer and argue that that's lower trust. You can't, again, I can't inspect it. I can only make a trust claim that commercial rules allow me to make, AKA, I asked for this, they gave me this, they say it's a SHA, I can verify the SHA, but that's it. Is that enough trust to put the vehicle on the road? I don't know. That's up to you as a company, right? But the framework gives you, finally, we believe, the ability to ask the questions, challenge the responses, and then come to independent conclusions, and then debate it societally. So we don't make a claim right or wrong about whether AI should or shouldn't be used. We just say that the framework allows for you to determine if it's used. How do you assess its ability from a confidence standpoint in what you're shipping?
Fair enough. Okay. Well, as we think about winding down our conversation here, I do want to ask you about the roadmap, because I suspect that the ETSF is not a static thing, that, this is shifting, this is dynamic. So talk to me about what the project is contemplating next.
Well, I mean, there's a couple different elements. One is Codethink as one of the contributors and one of the users of the framework demonstrated the ability to take a third party, right, or to take a standard, aka in this case 61508, and map it TSF, and then show how we could take a thing against the TSF and be able to satisfy 61508. we would want and look to see any number of those kinds of mappings happening. We believe CRA is one that's rich, and we're working through. We're also working, internally with a number of the different stakeholders from different companies, right, to take the Eclipse development process and to also make it part of like a TSF. So generally speaking, anyone can say, I want to be assessed against TSF, and they can ask for what the assessment should be focused on. 61508, Eclipse Trustable Framework, 26262, 31. Name your favorite standard, right? And the mappings exist, and suddenly you're able to prove this. And so what that does is it in essence simplifies for development engineers the ability to say, like, what am I needing to worry about? Because unfortunately, one of the other outcomes of our current approach is all the standards are proprietary, and you need a license. And the licenses, generally speaking, are to a single person. So UK can get a 62 or 26262 license, but it's only to you. You can't share it with your colleagues or your friends or anyone else. Regardless of its expensiveness, that doesn't foster the kinds of engineering conversation that we think needs to happen in a world of such criticality of the software in question. So being able to say, yes, you're reasoning at the TSF level, you're debating at the TSF level, you're debating in open, you're debating at a societal level, right, is where that's one of the big roadmap items to try and get to. And we started, Codethink was able to contribute. We did under an early release, our 61508 mapping that got us to where we were with our assessments. One of the next ones up is going to be the CRA. The Eclipse group is trying to figure out how best to do that. And then we're open to anyone else, coming along and saying, oh, I've got another standard that I want to be able to look at. And okay, great. How do we do that?
That is a full plate. Sounds like you got your work cut out for you. I look forward to seeing where this goes. Okay. So before I sign us off here, John, where are you directing folks who want more information? Where should they look?
In short, it's the Eclipse Trustable Software Framework project, which exists inside of the Eclipse organization.
I will include a link in the show notes here to that so that folks can follow up. I have really enjoyed speaking with you today, John. This has been an absolute pleasure. And again, my name is Kate Holterhoff. I'm a senior analyst at RedMonk. If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and review the Monkcast on your podcast platform of choice. If you're watching us on RedMonk's YouTube channel, please like, subscribe, and engage with us in the comments.